We're going to spend this week talking about communications, and we know that no team or organization can exist without communication. And when we talk about communication, all we're talking about is the transference and understanding of meaning. One of the best ways to increase your team and organizational effectiveness is to reduce stress and conflict, and doing that through better communication. So if we look at the functions of communication, we know that communication serves four major functions within a team or an organization, and all four of these are important. The first one is control. So when we look at control, formal and informal communication acts to control team member behavior, because you have to have some type of control. You don't want, as my parents used to say, everything running amok and everyone going in different directions. You also need motivation. So communication will increase motivation by clarifying what needs to be done, how well it needs to be done, and what can be done to improve the performance. There's also one of the functions would be emotional expression. Since many employees, their work group is their primary source for social interaction, communication provides a release for the emotional expression of feelings and the fulfillment of social needs. And then the fourth one, function of communication is information. Communication facilitates decision making by providing data needed to identify and evaluate alternative choices. So let's take a look at the communication process. Looking at this in this chart, this gives us the communication model. So before communication can take place, it needs a purpose. It has to be expressed as a message to be conveyed, and then that message passes between a sender and a receiver. The message is encoded. That means that it's converted to a symbolic form, and then it's passed by some medium or some channel to the receiver, who retranslates or decodes the message. So successful communication results in the transference of meaning from one person to another. So with this component, we know that the sender, if you'll look at that, that's on the left-hand side. The sender is the person who initiates a message by encoding it into a thought. And encoding, again, that's just converting the thought into symbols and also into language. And then from that comes your message, and that's the encoded thought that has to be transferred. The channel, if you'll look at that, that's the medium through which the message travels. And there's really two basic channels for communication in organizations. There's formal channels, and that's the path which messages travel. It's established by a hierarchy of the organization, and messages sent by these channels are normally related to professional activities of the members of that organization. Then there's also informal channels, and that's spontaneous channels that emerge in a response to individual choices. And those messages typically are sent through channels. They're often personal or they're social. So you'll see decoding happens. That's over there with the receiver. That's converting a message from symbols and language back into a thought. And then it's with the receiver, that's the person with whom the message is directed. Now, if you look underneath that channel, we know that there's noise, because there are communication barriers that can distort the clarity of the message. And that can be just perceptual problems. Maybe they're not really understanding what's happening. It's information overload. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a meeting or in a situation where it's so much information coming at you. It's like a fire hydrant effect, and you can't really grasp everything that's coming at you. It could be semantic difficulties. It could also be cultural differences where you're truly not understanding because culturally it's not appropriate to what you're accustomed to. That happens a lot of times, especially when you are dealing with people from different cultures, people from a different country, and not fully understanding what they're saying. The feedback, that's just the information sent from the receiver back to the sender to indicate how successful that transference of communication was. So if we look at the direction of communication, it's very fluid. It can flow vertically, it can flow laterally, and vertical communications can be upwards. They can also be downwards from a person's position within an organization. So let's talk about that a little bit. If we have downward communication, that's communication that flows from one level of the team or organization to a lower level within that organization. This is typically used by leaders, managers to assign goals, provide job instructions, inform their employees of policies or procedures. They might want to point out a problem that needs attention, and they offer feedback about performance. That's typically what happens. Now, upward communication, that's the communication that moves upward through the organization's hierarchy, and it's used to provide feedback to organizational superiors, inform superiors of progress towards a goal, or to relay current problems. And that communication can be anonymous. It could be through suggestion boxes, it could also be surveys, or it can be face-to-face and personal. And then if we look at lateral, when we talk about lateral communication, that's the communication that takes place among people in the same work group or work team. It's the same level of the hierarchy, among managers at the same level, or between any horizontally equivalent personnel. And that communication is to help facilitate coordination and save time. And these lateral relationships may be formally sanctioned, or a lot of times they can be informal. They're just created to short circuit the vertical hierarchy and just to quickly have some action that needs to happen. Let's talk about interpersonal communication, and there are three basic methods of communication, and that's oral, written, or nonverbal. So let's take a look at oral communication. When we talk about that, this is the chief means of conveying a message. It could be in the form of speeches, formal one-on-one and group discussions, or even talk along the grapevine. And the advantages of oral communication, it's quick and the feedback can be received just as quickly. And it can make corrections just relatively simple. Now, there's disadvantages to oral communication because it's subject to personal interpretation when it's passed through a number of people. So when that message gets to that final destination, it may not be what the one that you intended or that person intended to send. And there's so many times that if you just have oral communication, that the message is not conveyed clearly. So that brings us to written communication. This is a form of communication. It includes memos, letters, fax transmissions, Slack messages, email, instant message, periodicals, notices, any other means by which ideas are transmitted through written word or symbols. Now, the advantages of written communication is it's tangible, it's verifiable, it provides a record of communication that can be stored and made available for future reference. Because of the time and effort involved in creating written communications, they tend to be better thought out, more logical, they're clearer typically than oral communication. Now, there's disadvantages because written communication can be extremely time consuming. Sometimes it has slow or no feedback, and it may not be received or read well by the intended recipient. It can not be interpreted well. It can also fall into the wrong hands. It may be something that you've written down and maybe you wrote it just for that person, but it can be shared, it can be forwarded, and you have to be careful with that. I've had a lot of issues of people maybe sending something that might have been borderline, might not have been appropriate, and then sent on down the line. So you have to be careful with that. Nonverbal communication, and the two, when we look at that, that's the form of communication. It includes body movements, intonations or emphasis given to words, facial expressions, and the physical distance between that sender and receiver. So if we look at the forms of that body language, we see that any movement of the body can have meaning. So body language conveys two important messages: the degree of like or interest in another, and the perceived status differences between people. Body language both enhances and complicates verbal communication because we make inferences with that, so we have to be careful with that. The intonation, that gives the emphasis to words or phrases in verbal communication, and just changing the intonation of a set of words can completely change the meaning. And let me just tell you here that sarcasm does not translate well. So be extremely careful in your sarcastic messages that you give verbally, and especially when you have the nonverbal that goes along with it. Your facial expressions. With intonation, facial expressions can change the meaning of words that are being communicated. And facial expressions allow people to add any emotional content that they want to use. So, and I'm not the poker face, so I have to be careful with that, because if I'm feeling it, it's typically on my face. Physical distance, while highly dependent on cultural norms, the space between people can convey messages. Typically, the closer two people are, the more intimate they are, and formal relationships are often demonstrated by greater distances between two people. And you guys may know of people, I call them close talkers, where it makes you uncomfortable. You're just, I'm very aware. I want people at an arm's length distance. I don't like people up in my face talking, so that makes me extremely uncomfortable. So we have to work with people, and we have to understand that we need to keep that distance and have that. So for effective communication to occur, it's important that the verbal and nonverbal communication messages are aligned. Okay, we're going to stop here on this lecture, and we will pick up with organizational communication.